Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Delighted to be here tonight. My name is Tony Cully Foster. I have the privilege of chairing the Global Communications Committee of the World Affairs Council, D.C. We have a very distinguished panel here tonight. Two basic tenets of journalism, the facts and the truth. And it is my hope tonight that we'll hear plenty of both from this distinguished lineup. And the other adage I'd like you to give some thought to tonight, we live in an information age where perception is often thought of as reality. So it is the job of these distinguished journalists to sift for the facts and the truth. And tonight we're going to get a global perspective from the United Kingdom, from Spain, from Tokyo, and from Lebanon. So it's my honor now to introduce Beverly Kirk, a member of the World Affairs Council Board of Directors, who is our moderator tonight. Beverly.
Tony, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here this evening. I'm going to introduce our panelists. You have a full bio that you should have picked up on the way in. I'm going to hit the high points so that we can get straight into our conversation. The topic we are speaking about tonight is from Snowden to Syria to the shutdown, what the rest of the world thinks about Washington, how the rest of the world views Washington, and there is plenty to say on this topic. So I want to start by introducing the panelists. Here to my left is Mr. Hideomi Kinoshita. He is currently the Washington Bureau Chief for Kyodo News. He joined Kyodo News in 1987 and has been assigned to the political news department in Tokyo and has covered 10 prime ministers. Welcome. Seated next to him is Mr. Hisham Melhem from Arabiya News Channel. He's a Lebanese journalist who currently serves as the Washington Bureau Chief for Arabiya, and he is a correspondent for An-Nahar newspaper. He has appeared as a news commentator about Middle Eastern issues and other foreign policy areas on the PBS NewsHour for nearly 20 years. Seated next to him is Ms. Maria Peña. She is a journalist for EFE News Services, Agencia EFE, from Spain. She covers Congress and the White House and issues affecting the Hispanic community here in the United States and all of Latin America. She's also a regular media panelist with various news outlets, including Univision, CNN Espanol, and Voice of America. And at the end of the table is Mr. David Taylor from The Times in London. He covers Washington politics as well as U.S. culture, and that's everything from RG3 stats to Beyonce and Jay-Z, and kind of everything in between with the focus on politics. He's been in journalism for 25 years, and he's worked for The Guardian and the London Evening Standard. So thanks to all of you for joining us. The way this is going to work, each of our panelists will make an opening statement, brief remarks for a few moments, then I'll question them, and then you get to question them. So without further ado, Mr. Kinoshita.
Thank you so much, Beverly. It's quite a great privilege and a wonderful opportunity to have a discussion with very seasoned colleagues and before you about the foreign policy in the U.S. government. On behalf of the reporters from Asia, not only from Tokyo, so I'd like to shed light on the how the people in Asia see Washington, D.C. And I would also comment on the some very, very critical issues, including the how to strengthen the U.S. presence in Asia. So the President Obama's signature in his foreign policy, the rebalancing to Asia or pivot to Asia, still the people in Asia do not understand what is really means that kind of thing. So I was very, very required I'm very looking forward to discussing and exchange compared notes on with you on pivot to Asia. Thank you.
Mr. Melhem?
You want me to talk about the shutdown, about Snowden, about Syria? I mean, I can spend an hour. What do you want? Let me know. On the shutdown, I wrote an article last week talking about what I've seen in this country from the 1970s till now, including the Reagan phenomena. And I'm always struck by this uniquely American phenomena, which is American politicians are in love with demonizing Washington. At the same time, they want to be seduced by the pleasures of Washington. And during the Reagan years, we began to see what was traditionally a great gift in the American political system, which is that skepticism that the American citizenry always held towards the federal government or centralized government, that healthy skepticism, which is part of the American political DNA, evolved into a hatred of government. Government, in the words of Ronald Reagan, became the problem. And with that, there was a hostile view of taxes, of the concept of taxes, as if one could have civilization and culture without taxation. And we see now, on the part of some Americans, particularly the so-called Tea Party, the American jihadists, if you will, of the political system in Washington, this attitude towards government, which is tantamount to the attitude of people involved in political cults or political sects. It's absolutist. And government is the problem, government is evil, including taxation and all that. And we see that this minority in the great GOP, great old party, glorious party, the party of Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and Eisenhower, is now producing people like Ted Cruz. On the margin of any, this man would be on the margin of any political, any democratic system in the West, except here. So there is something uniquely American about shutting down the government. In fact, even in failed states, you don't shut down the government. In parliamentary system in Europe and in Canada, you don't have this concept of shutting down government. It just doesn't work. But only in the United States. And this is partly due to the great Constitution. And believe me, I became an American citizen. When people ask me why did I become an American citizen, I always say it's because of what I would call my secular Bible. And my secular Bible is the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, Federalist Papers, and everything written by Jefferson. I live in Virginia by choice because I love Jefferson, seriously. And yet you have in this Constitution, the seeds of this kind of division, separation of powers. And once in a while, we reach this point. This is probably one of the most sophisticated, great political system in the history of the Western culture, Western world. And yet, in the year 2000, we had the crisis and the paradox of one candidate winning the popular vote and another candidate not winning the popular vote, but the guy who did not win the popular vote won the presidency. Go figure. But this is the electoral system that we have. So the shutdown really struck people in the Middle East and in other parts of the world, but I talk about the Middle East. There was this sense of bewilderment. There was this sense of confusion. There was this sense of glee. There was this sense of schadenfreude. People were happy to see the American great political system stuck in the mud. You know that schadenfreude is a great German concept, which is having pleasure in the pain of somebody else's. We don't have an English equivalent to it. There's an Arabic equivalent to it, which is really almost as good as schadenfreude. But schadenfreude, many people were feeling schadenfreude without knowing what the hell they were feeling. Just seeing the Americans in a bind. So explaining, look, to me as a journalist, it's always fun explaining the unexplainable in Washington to people who have absolutely no idea how the American political system functions. Especially many of the people who watch me on Arab television live in societies that are not democratic. So when I explain to them the complexities, I feel like I'm providing some sort of a guide to the perplexed. And it's not easy sometimes to explain the system, but this is really, people are really wondering what is wrong with these people in Washington. Seriously. Now, let me move quickly to Syria. On Syria, I was always for a more robust, strong American position vis-a-vis what's taking place in Syria. This is a historic calamity. We have at least 125,000 people who were killed in 2 years. And yet the President of the United States for a long time opted to ignore this problem. And yet he is the same man who 2 years ago, in August of 2 years ago, asked Bashar al-Assad to step down and did nothing about it. A year ago, exactly in August, more than a year now, he set certain quote-unquote red lines. If you move weapons of mass, the chemical weapons, let alone use them, you will be crossing that red line that I, as the President of the United States, am setting for you. And we know from American intelligence that chemical weapons were used a few months ago, before August, before the major attack. And yet, what did the President do? He asked his Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, to talk to us as journalists on the phone at 5 o'clock in the evening, on the phone, to tell us the President decided now to provide some light arms to the opposition. 3-4 months later, nothing arrived, not even one bullet, as the leaders of the opposition said. And then we had the August attack. The President, after soul searching, after acting like Hamlet, and he has been great as acting like Hamlet, decided that he is going to do something. And he said so publicly. Then, lo and behold, our friends the Brits, in their infinite wisdom in the Parliament, decided not to give David Cameron the green light to participate in the attack. The White House went into panic mode. The President discovered that he has to consult Congress, which is, by the way, is hogwash. He doesn't have to consult Congress. The American President, we call him the Imperial President, has enough legal authority to strike Syria militarily and then come back to the Congress. No American president since 1973 have ever accepted the War Powers Act or lived by it. Let's be frank about this. And then you had the Secretary Kerry saying that when he was asked the question, what can Assad do to avoid a military strike? Kerry said, well, he can in 1 week get rid of his chemical weapons. The Russians jumped on this, and they said, we will give you a proposal, and they did. The President of the United States changed his mind. He was supposed to address the nation and ask the Congress for approval. He ended up asking the Congress not to give him the green light to attack Syria. It was a spectacle. And the President looked weak, looked indecisive, looked wobbly, looked professorial. He did not look as someone who is really in charge of the sole superpower in the world. That's my view, but that's not only my personal view. That's the view of a lot of people in the Middle East. Snowden. I was happy that the Washington Post finally got a good kick and reasserted itself as a major newspaper in Washington when they published some of the information leaked by Snowden, and as well as, of course, with the Guardian. And as an American citizen, as someone who, in a moment of bliss, decided to become an American, not by chance, but by will, and because I believe in the Constitution, and because I believe that if there is a decision by the courts to monitor someone's telephone conversation with somebody overseas, I have no problem with that. But I don't want my government to spy on me. So I was grateful for, not only for Snowden today, I was grateful for the New York Times 6 years ago, 2006, when they revealed for the first time the SNA program, listening to our conversation, but some of our conversations with people overseas, suspected of ties to terrorism. That's fine. And I don't think the president came up with convincing answers, and I'm hoping that the media will continue, to focus on this issue and to ask the right questions and to probe and to uncover all sorts of things that maybe hopefully would force the Congress to be responsible and maintain and safeguard the civil rights of all of us as citizens. Now, on the other hand, I don't mind in the least to be told or not told that the United States is spying on Iran, that the United States is spying on China, that the United States is spying on Russia. I hope they do. And if your friends spy on you, fine. You should have thick skin, take it and live with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Peña.
I wanted to follow up. I had a different idea starting, when I first walked in. I wanted to follow up on that last point where he said that the U.S., he has no problem with the U.S. spying on everyone else. It rang a bell. It reminded me of an interview I did at the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks ago. It was a Friday. I had the chance to do a one-on-one interview with the Undersecretary of State for Latin America, Roberta Jacobson. She's well respected. She's fluent in Spanish. She knows the region. She knows the issues. So I sat down with her and we sort of did a review of the different, global and regional interests and U.S. foreign policy. And one soundbite in that interview really struck me where she said, even with our closest allies, we don't have to share everything. And that kind of is summarized the problem that some of the partners in the region are having with that with the NSA program, because I don't know if you recall that when it was made public that the president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, and the Brazilian president, Dilma Rousseff, were being spied on by this ally, the United States, all hell broke loose. It caused a big stir in the region, so much so that Dilma Rousseff postponed her visit to the White House, which was by the way, was slated for October 23rd. And so in her place, they're bringing the Pakistani prime minister, I believe. So, it's caused a lot of tension. I have very close relations with the Mexican embassy and Mexican authorities. They too were upset, but they were appeased, for lack of a better word. They were appeased because when President Obama met with Peña Nieto at the G20 in St. Petersburg a little bit ago, he pledged to do a full investigation of what happened and why. And at least publicly, the Mexicans seem satisfied that they've been promised this investigation. No timeline on it, so who knows when the results will come out. But it did cause a big problem in the relationship because the Mexico is a very close ally. It's an emerging power in the region. And, this is not the way you treat allies. It's fine if you treat enemies that way, but this is not the way you treat allies. And during that General Assembly, the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, had a news conference. He was very combative, very anti-American, a lot of anti-American, very heated rhetoric. And he went on and on about American imperialism. And one of the points he raised was, hey, listen, fine if you spy on your enemies. It's almost expected. It's expected that you do. But come on, your own allies, the people you trade with, Mexico is one of the largest trade partners for the U.S. And more goods, come from Mexico assembled with U.S. parts than China and any of the other countries combined. So, that's one situation where it's caused a lot of problems. They're trying to go beyond that, of course, because you can't really be stuck there. You have to find a way out, and they're trying to, move beyond that and work on other issues that are mutual and regional interest. So the NSA scandal has gotten a big play in Latin America. Now, FA is an international newswire, and we bring a unique perspective to the table because not only do we cover issues for our international audience throughout Latin America and Spain and other parts of Europe, but we also cover issues for our internal audience, which is the Hispanic community. It's the biggest, fastest growing market there is right now. So, for instance, the shutdown at least, in Spain and elsewhere, of course, it's gotten a lot of play too because of the economic implications. But from the U.S. side, from the U.S. perspective, it's also a big issue for the Hispanic community that we cover here because, when you run out of money to, fund government operations, a lot of the Hispanic community that we cater to are low-income immigrants who depend on a lot of social programs that have been shut down effectively. And even today, I just came from a rally over in the mall where 8 congressmen were arrested for supporting immigration reform. It was a Civil Disobedience Act. The shutdown issue came up because the only reason it was held is that it's a First Amendment issue. So even though there's no money to provide security at the mall, you can't stop people from protesting. They have a legal and constitutional right to do so. So it was interesting how those two issues kind of, melded together today. And with Syria, of course, the red line issue has gotten a lot of big play in Spain and elsewhere because, it brings into question U.S. leadership. If you're threatening to do something and then don't do it, then it questions your authority and your leadership. And then thankfully, of course, they've been trying to find a diplomatic way. The UN resolution certainly helped. So now they're in the process of making this work and hopefully get rid of all those weapons. But it's interesting that those 3 issues have different perspectives depending on which audience you're targeting. And so with us, we have that unique perspective because we're catering to international and domestic audiences as well. So, and I'm here to answer whatever questions you have on these issues or any other issues that we cover for our newswire.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you. Well, I want to come at this from a slightly different angle and just think about, I suppose, some of the parallels between Britain and the US. And it struck me after another Byzantine day watching the shutdown that if you ask yourself the question, how does the world view Washington? It seems to me it's a bit like a viewer in the last season of Breaking Bad, and it's just this bizarre, strange, gripping, hard to understand drama, and you can hardly bear to watch it. It's so painful, but at the same time you want to know what happens at the end. So I feel with Britain, we're currently going through a fairly rare period of coalition government for us, and so we have this interesting interplay where there is the dominant Tory parties currently tacking to the right. They're trying to keep their base happy, and there are definite parallels. You feel like you might have a bit of an intuitive grasp of what's playing out within the Republican Party. But I think what's surprising to a British audience is perhaps that we have, because of the epithet Commander-in-Chief, we maybe bestow too much power on the president, and we were swept away perhaps by the rhetoric of 2008 and imagined that he was going to be this great agent of change. And I think there has been a creeping process of disappointment, really. And in a way, we shouldn't have been surprised because we lived through the Tony Blair era where he arrived in 97, changed the landscape in Britain, and so much hope was instilled in him that he couldn't help but fail, really. It was calculated to disappoint, and it seems the same tension is here for Barack Obama. But I did just want to talk a little bit about parallels, because I think that there is something going on at the moment with the political class and the public, both in Britain and America, and it seems that it's partly to do with the traumas of the Iraq War, and it's also partly to do with the handling of the economic crisis. You have a public which is no longer really willing to give a free pass for military action, and you also have a public which has had its confidence knocked because of the handling of the economic crisis running up to it, and what's flowed from it, the fact that all of the ideas have been different on either side of the Atlantic, but the effects have been at best sluggish, and we're all limping out of recession. So I think there's a little bit of a double-edged thing of fear, really, about your nation's place in the world, and also a bit of a sense of confidence that you will do better than the previous generation. It doesn't really seem to be there anymore. So I do feel that the vote on Syria, which seemed to surprise so many people late at night in the UK, was symptomatic of that, really, that even where people are faced with potentially owning some of the moral responsibility for not acting on gassing of children with chemical weapons, they're willing to perhaps turn inward a little bit and don't really want so much ambition from their leaders. So I think that's playing out, and it's certainly our readers, I think, are enjoying that parallel in a way. I think one of the other things I want to say early on was just that there are challenges for journalists trying to communicate and illuminate with an audience back at home, not least because I think people have some preconceived ideas which they take quite a long time to let go of. So I do think that, for instance, Obama will probably remain an immensely popular president for a lot of years in the UK, simply because he was such an invigorating presence when he broke through, and it feels a little bit similar to what follows us around here, which is a huge respect for Tony Blair, even though he's become an immensely divisive figure back at home, and also for Margaret Thatcher. So Margaret Thatcher died, and there was an outpouring of grief here that perhaps didn't quite match what was going on, certainly in half of Britain, where she was still a hate figure, really. And it was interesting to me that we thought of Thatcher as a divisive figure in Britain's social history, and here she was regarded as a Cold War heroine and the person who stood with Ronald Reagan and still to be admired. And it was definitely a moment where I felt we learned something in refraction, really, about her standing. I think one of the other the hot issues of gun control is one where a British audience comes with very preconceived ideas, and they're quick to stereotype the American view that they're all crazy and they won't give up their guns. And I think that more nuanced understanding that there feels like there is a public movement afoot, and that notwithstanding the inertia in Congress on the issue, you go to the mall, you see events, you speak with families, you speak with campaigners, and they will tell you a story about 6 states where tougher gun controls have come into force since Sandy Hook, and they feel that there is progress. And I think that's a very nuanced message, which is quite hard sometimes to tell in 400 words, or even the rare days we might get 1,000 words to try and tell people what we're seeing. And I suppose I just wanted to finish by also just saying, if you ask that question, well, how are we viewed? It's quite instructive to flip it round and think, well, what is it that you think of when you imagine Britain? And it strikes me quite quickly that people will think of royal babies and perhaps Wimbledon and our apparently socialist healthcare system. And, there isn't a conversation, I promise you, that we can have at the moment in Washington without Downton Abbey being brought to bear. So I'm not going to give you any spoilers on season 4, you'll be pleased to know. But there's no question on, when firstly Thatcher and then hard on the heels, Prince George arrived, and we actually had people knocking on the door of our office to come and congratulate us on the royal birth, and we accepted graciously. But we didn't think
you had something to do with it.
Yeah, well, exactly. And, but I did sort of think, well, didn't you guys make your call on that about 240 years ago? So it it's our ambassador
We
talked.
need heroes.
Yeah, perhaps even if they're. Yes, and our ambassador who threw a party, never want to miss the moment. Did slightly tongue in cheek say that he feared that America might be having a little bit of buyer's remorse. But I do think there's more that unites us than divides us. That's clear every day.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to delve in more on the conversation about what the world thinks of the government shutdown and their concerns about America's position in the world as a leader. You've all kind of alluded to that. And the reason I want to delve into it, I have to confess, I teach writing for communication to students at American University. And in last night's class, I had them watching international news. And one of the stories that just literally leaped off the screen and grabbed their attention was how France 24, covered the U.S. shutdown and what the reporters and analysts in Paris had to say about how this was going on in America and how it was impacting the rest of the world. And one of my students looked up and said, wow, we must really look stupid to the rest of the world. And this is, you have to keep in mind, these are freshmen and sophomores at American University who told me they don't watch the news. But that was just an instantaneous gut reaction from the class. So I'm wondering, when you're covering this, what are people saying in your comments and on your website sections about America and its leadership and its position in the world? What's the feedback you're getting?
Well, the thing is, I'm glad you brought that up because I believe it was Marie Harf, one of the State Department spokesperson. At one of the briefings, she even brought up the fact that two important Spanish dailies headlined, something along the lines of, Washington is shutting down, they're paralyzed, what's going on? Are they going nuts? Along those lines. Because people don't understand how is it possible that you can't get your act together and pass a budget and fund the government. And so our job here from our perspective here is to explain what does it really mean. It doesn't necessarily mean a shutdown. The government doesn't shut down. It's only certain non-essential programs that are discontinued. So it's kind of like we end up having to play the role of teachers to explain, well, what does it mean? Does it mean what they're seeing, veterans being turned away from the monuments, the parks being closed, or, people not getting to visit the museums or the zoo or the panda cam, those things that, people...
Really important, that panda cam.
People, it may not obviously affect them personally, but they just can't get, they can't wrap their head around the idea that Washington is so dysfunctional. And every president that has come through the White House has promised bipartisanship and working in a bipartisan way. And somehow something happens along the way, the honeymoon's over, and there is no bipartisanship. And then what you end up having is this blame game. And even today, there was still the blame game going on. So we need to explain to people, number one, that they can't understand why is it that the U.S. does not have more than two parties. Competition is healthy. Competition is good. Let us have a Green Party. Let us have a Tea Party. Let us compete for people's voices and votes. They don't understand that. In Europe, you have like all these coalitions and all these different, a whole range of political ideologies, whereas here it's either Democrats or Republicans, maybe a little independent, nothing in between. Mm-hmm. And things are not such, they're not black and white issues. I have had to, like for instance, during the conventions, I have interviewed voters who are, conservative in certain issues and liberal on other issues. And, with the Hispanic community, for instance, it is not monolithic. Yes, most lean Democrats or are affiliated with Democrats, but when you quiz them on issues like abortion or because of their upbringing abroad, from Latin America, they tend to be a little more conservative on that, in that respect. So for us, we feel that it's a whole teaching process for people who just simply cannot understand how this government and how this society works. So yes, it's sad that the simplest way to do things or to try to get an understanding is to rely on stereotypes. And that's not always the reality. So you end up having to play the teacher role. Okay, well, this is what it means. You had said earlier that people think we're crazy and all of that. What I can tell you though is that at least when there's a heated debate on the Hill, you don't see congressmen throwing chairs at each other or punching each other, even if they want to.
It's only week 2 though.
But you watch.
Not yet.
You watch what happens in other people's congresses, other countries' parliaments, right. And you're like, wait, isn't this supposed to be a civil discourse? Isn't it supposed to be, people exchanging ideas and agreeing to disagree, mm-hmm. or trying to find a consensus? There's a lot to be said for how democracy works in this country, and for all the rhetoric you hear in Europe and anti-Americanism. There's a lot of admiration. So in balance, I think it ends up being a love-hate kind of relationship with the U.S. Or they also make a distinction between, okay, the American people and U.S. foreign policy and how it's implemented. So there's a lot of play there. You can't, our job is to explain, okay, why is this happening and why should you care? And it's a big task. It's not easy. And it's not easy when if you're a foreign outlet with no roots in the society like we have here, you don't get a lot of access to high-ranking officials. You end up getting a press release. That, to me, it's not the best way to do journalism, mm-hmm. because you're being fed a message as opposed to having the opportunity to dig further. So it's a big challenge for us as foreign journalists, which, like I said earlier, yes, we're covering foreign policy and all those other issues that people care about abroad, but we're also catering to a local Hispanic community as well. So we're a little bit different in that respect. But it comes back down to explaining why it is that things work or don't work in Washington.
I think for us, Ted Cruz's green eggs and ham moment was a great gift, because it suddenly... It was an entry point, really, that people thought, what on earth is going on? And that allowed us to start peeling away some of the layers of Republican Party politics, because since the election, really, we've been trying to convey this idea that, whilst there may well be one faction that dreams of one day getting back the White House, there are others who really are only concerned about being primaried in their own district from the right, and a lot of different agendas in between. So I think this has given us the chance to try and give people a much more sophisticated view of what's happening and the tensions within that party. So I think he was not a figure in the UK a month ago, and he is now. John Boehner was a peripheral figure and is now more well known. And I think it's interesting that although people do think they're crazy, they also, I think they're more nuanced than that. And certainly with our readers, there's an understanding that when you last went round this course and it was Clinton and Gingrich, that there was actually a dialogue going on every day. And so they have that level of understanding, and they do understand that perhaps the president has been culpable in not trying to play nicely on the Hill and not reaching out quite as much as he should have done. And perhaps, even though that's happening now with a new chief of staff, it's perhaps a little too late, and maybe it's only working with one civilized wing of the Republicans.
Okay. When I began to cover the politics in Tokyo, so my senior colleague told me that the politics is the result of a lot of the compromises. So I think the Speaker Boehner and the GOP side is very, very forgettable guys. And I think also the Washington should pay attention to the reaction from the world on the Japan and China. China is the largest creditor of a U.S. federal bond, and Japan is the second largest creditor bond, and both of them are very now getting nervous of undervalued dollar. And the Chinese economy is very now the driving force in Asia and the world, and the Chinese economy is backed by the foreign investment, particularly from the United States. So I think the both sides of the GOP side and the Demo side much more should be much more careful about how to handle the world economy. Still, the American economy is much bigger than the China and the Japan or India. So I think the U.S. government is much more responsible for the world economy. Keep stable.
Before we get to you, Mr. Melhem, I just want to follow up, Mr. Kinoshita. The president had to cancel his visit to Asia because of the shutdown. What are the folks that watch your newscast and read Asian newspapers, what are they saying about that? Because we were supposed to be pivoting to Asia.
Right.
And here you have the president of the United States saying, oops, I can't come because I got to deal with Congress.
Yeah, I got a quite good headline which summarizes the people's sentiment in Asia. Why is the U.S. president? His cancellation trip to Asia, including the APEC meeting and the TPP negotiations, undermines definitely the U.S. credibility in the region. Last week, the President Xi of China visited Indonesia and Malaysia, and he was very welcomed by both those countries, and he succeeded to agree with his counterpart on like military cooperation and the trade relations. And I think maybe I would say that maybe I would not say that China has much more functional government than United States has, but at least to say that I think the U.S. government performance is downgraded in Asia very much.
I don't know if you heard the comment. I wasn't there because I was covering this immigration rally, but President Obama had a news conference today, and apparently I heard one of my colleagues saying that he had said something along the lines of, I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there, at the summit, and, he wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese were all happy about it because the Americans weren't there to contest whatever ideas were being thrown out there. So that kind of made headlines too.
Let me just
his comments.
make sure to comment that China is very happy to play a major role without the United States in the region, but in the long term, China is very concerned that because China's economy, as I mentioned, was very supported by the U.S. economy. So I think still China needs U.S. economy to meet up their standards.
So in other words, what I hear you saying is that on the one hand, yes, it might be good politically for the president of China to have the stage to himself this week without President Obama being there. But on the other hand, China owns so much of U.S. debt that dysfunction could be costly in the long run.
Yeah, definitely China is very uncomfortable with the very undervalued U.S. dollar. So it's going to be I think maybe couple of decades ago, then the Prime Minister of Japan mentioned that I would like to withdraw Japan's money from the United States. So very Washington is very upset about that remarks. So I think maybe China is very cautious in handling the situation right now. So the short answer is yes, China is very happy without the United States government, and wrong answer is not.
All right, Mr. Melhem, What are the folks in the Middle East saying about the shutdown? You talked a lot about it in your opening comments, but how is this viewed? You brought up the point that the president looked weak on Syria. Is this again another place where people in the region see him as being weak?
Well, there is this view that is held by many people in the Middle East, not only Arabs, but Turks and maybe even Iranians, even Israelis, that the United States in the last 100 and 150 years has been omniscient and omnipresent in the Middle East. That it has a tremendous power and influence in the Middle East, and its influence not only economic, it's political, it is cultural. And yet when they see this kind of dysfunction, it's difficult for them to absorb it intellectually. I mean, how is it that this new Rome, if you will, cannot, set its house in order? And they come to us and they go to the Africans in Latin America and other places, these emerging markets and in the developing countries, quote unquote, and give them lectures about fiscal responsibility.
Good governance.
Good governance. No, I mean, good governance, we have good governance, but I mean fiscal responsibility, paying your debts or whatever, and then they don't even do it in the United States. So they see it, in a paradoxical way, and it's difficult for them to understand it. Now, if we focus on the theatrics of what takes place in Washington, the green eggs and ham and Sam I am of Ted Cruz, or the clownish behavior of what's her name, this woman who ran for presidency, Michelle Bachmann. Yeah, and you can see how kind of respect that I have for these guys. I mean, if you can focus on the theatrics, you lose sight of what's taking place in the country. And what is taking place in the country is really transformational. And there is, in a way, a leadership crisis. There is also a direction crisis. This is the first, and we've seen it in our history here. We are still living in the shadow of the longest war in American history and the second longest war in American history. The American economy is not the economy that used to be 30 years ago, 40 years ago. At the end of the Second World War, I don't know if you know this, the size of the American economy was almost 45% of the world economy. And it's been shrinking ever since. So we don't have the economic power that we have. I'll give you a tiny example. The other day, a coup occurred in Egypt. The Egyptians claim that this is not a coup, so we call it the non-coup coup. Okay? And then we were threatening to withhold the aid. And at most, we give the Egyptians, $1.5 billion a year. And so the Gulf Arabs said, we don't care. I mean, you cannot influence them. We don't believe that this is a coup, and we are going to give Egypt a package of support amounting to $12 billion. This is a new development. So the American influence is shrinking. There is also the perception in the world that America's international responsibilities are shrinking, particularly under this president, who may have, and I do believe this, by the way, overlearned the lessons of Iraq.
My name is Jim Bullock. I'm actually retired State Department, and since retiring, I've been teaching like you do. I teach at GW, and my students, we have a seminar on media and foreign policy, and we look at how governments attempt to shape the messages that will advance their various foreign policy goals. Stepping back, your topic tonight, I'd like to maybe a quick comment from all four, is not specific attitudes in the audiences you serve about particular issues, so much as this idea of how the country is viewed as a whole. So I'd be curious, what is the main source of information in your four areas about the United States? Is it the cinema? Is it media messaging put out by the host country governments? Is it media messaging of the United States? What is the main source of the main idea? If you said, Mr. Taylor, Britain, and you say, royal babies, or if you say United States and the four countries, what is the general kind of overview of the United States in the four countries, and what's the source of that? And then perhaps maybe, has that changed in your lifetime?
Thank you. David?
I think you're right. The popular culture, I think America's culture was hugely dominant around the world, and certainly since I was a kid, there are young people who aspire to American values because of the music they listen to, or the TV and the movies that they suck up. I think in curiously, even though we can all probably unite in maligning 24-hour rolling news and what it's done to our culture, I think weirdly for an international audience, having channels like CNN has probably meant that you get a lot of American news events straight into living rooms, and so it's uncomfortable for us, but you can watch Barack Obama do an hour-long press conference just as easily in London as you can in Washington. So I think that people are getting those who are real, American obsessives are getting access to the politicians over the heads of the media, which is probably helpful. And then we haven't really talked about websites. You'd be shocked to know how much influence BuzzFeed, Daily Beast, Huffington Post, non-traditional outlets have. So I think they're shaping.
Because you're in English, you have that specific advantage.
Yeah, I guess that's right.
Well, with us, I think it's a combination, and again, with us it's a little bit different because our services go out to all of Latin America and all the Spanish language media outlets in Spain and, of course, in Latin America. I think in Spain specifically, like David said, I think the internet has revolutionized the way people gain access to information. They may even bypass us, unfortunately. They click on a link, and then out pops President Obama with the soundbite of the day, or C-SPAN. You can watch a hearing on the Hill directly. You don't have to wait for us to package the story for you. You get all kinds of you get your information from all kinds of sources, and I would say that the media plays a huge role. Because a lot of people, literacy levels are really high, so more people read the newspapers. You get the movies also. A lot of the movies that are dubbed into Spanish, or the subtitles. So you get your messages from different sources. But I would argue that media still plays a huge role.
My name is Brana, and I'm a student at the University of California, San Diego. And my question is regarding the conflict in Bosnia, Kosovo, and now Syria. And what is the likelihood of some kind of a multinational body like the UN being the one that's primarily involved with such conflicts? And how likely is it that will happen in the future? And also possibly what the US will have to do with the empowerment of such a multinational body?
For me?
Who would like to take that? And if you can keep your answer kind of brief, we've got a couple more questions.
I don't believe that the UN will have a very serious role there, given the fact that the Security Council will be paralyzed by the Russian veto or the Chinese veto. Unless you have an understanding between the United States and those two countries, which I really don't see. The Russians are wedded to Bashar al-Assad. The problem with Putin is that he looks at Syria and he sees the equivalent of the Chechens, the rebels in Chechnya, that he crushed. If you look at pictures of Grozny, which is the capital of Chechnya, and you see what the old Soviet army did to it, and later on the Russian army did to it, you think that you're looking at Dresden. And he has no mercy for these people, and he is wedded to this guy, come what may. And I think the dithering in the United States and the West, but mostly in the United States, because the Brits and the French were much better than us in calling for a more robust role there, has allowed Syria to fester and to attract all these nasty characters. It is extremely difficult now to control it. It's not impossible, it's not too late necessarily, but it's infinitely more difficult than it was a year ago, definitely 2 years ago. But the United States can still provide the leadership that will influence the Turks, the Arabs, the French, and the British, and work with them to make it very difficult for these jihadists to come to Syria and to put pressure on the regime. I mean, if the president decided to go with the military strike, he could have crippled that regime and forced it to negotiations. I don't see that happening right now. He just said today, you negotiate ceasefire with another country. You don't negotiate ceasefire with the terrorists. So it will continue to be like that unless there is a change in the American posture to pursue really a more robust, more aggressive policy on the president.
But I think it's going to
departing the
hinge.
president.
I think it's going to hinge on what the inspectors are doing on the ground, because you got to remember, a couple of weeks back, the UN Security Council approved unanimously a resolution involving, Russia. It was actually, negotiated between the U.S. and Russia. Secretary of State, Secretary John Kerry, and the Russians, Sergei Lavrov, they met and they hashed up this agreement and they brought it to the UN Security Council. The Council approved unanimously a resolution along with the organization, that bans chemical weapons. And those two bodies are working together. It's part of an international effort, not just the U.S., but it's part of an international effort. And it just hinges on what the Syrian government allows it to do. I think there is still a chance to avoid a war. And like they said, the goal is to identify those sites, let the inspectors in, identify those weapons, and get rid of them. And that's what they're, to my knowledge, that's what they're still working on. So, it's not over yet.
My name is Travoris Culpepper. I'm a student at George Mason University. At Mr. Kinoshita, you had mentioned that China is worried about the fiscal issues here in America because they own a lot of debt here. And I wanted to know if this issue is lagged out, or are there policies in place to try to protect people from the economic implications?
Thank you.
Well, it's quite tough and very good question. Maybe I could not find a good solution, but I think maybe I would say that the United States government and the Chinese government and also Japanese government should think that U.S. dollar and renminbi and Japanese yen almost now is people could not expect the project the future of the economy. So I think maybe we should get together to discuss those kind of the very difficult issue and to keep the people in the United States, people in China, people in Japan, people in other countries are much more comfortable, much more richer, much more wealthier. So my idea is that we should focus on it, organize much more broader meetings in finding a solution of including a national debt in the United States government and other countries.
All right, panelists, fabulous job. Great discussion. Thanks to all of you. Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.